Why am I sitting in my own driveway at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, unable to walk through my own front door? Why is the woman I've loved for 11 years inside that house right now, unpacking a suitcase that I already know doesn't tell the whole story? Why did I spend the last 2 weeks not saying a single word when I had every right to say 1,000? Why did I call her father before I called a lawyer? And why, after everything I've done to hold this family together, does it feel like the most important conversation of my life is about to happen in a house that might not be mine much longer? My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 43 years old. I'm a structural engineer. I've spent my entire career making sure that things don't collapse, and for the last 14 days, I've been quietly doing the same thing for my marriage, though I still don't know if what I'm building will hold. My wife's name is Claire. Claire Donovan Webb, though she never really dropped the Donovan. I understood that. She earned a reputation in interior design under that name, and when you've spent a decade building something with your own two hands, you don't just set it aside because you changed your last name on a document at the courthouse. I never had a problem with it. That's the kind of man I've always tried to be. The kind who doesn't need his name on everything to feel secure. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party 11 years ago. She was arguing passionately with the host about why the sectional sofa was positioned all wrong, and she was completely right. I stood there watching her rearrange someone else's furniture without being asked, and I thought, that woman is either going to be the most exhausting person I've ever met, or the most interesting. Turned out she was both, and I fell in love with her anyway. We got married 4 years later, moved into a house in Raleigh that she designed herself from the baseboards up, and had 2 kids. Our son is 9 and our daughter is 7. We coach soccer together on Saturday mornings. We have a standing date night on the first Friday of every month. By every measure I know how to use, we built something solid. And then I made the mistake of checking the family iPad on a Sunday afternoon in October. It wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that because I've gone over it in my head enough times to know the difference. Our daughter uses that iPad for her reading app, and I was checking her progress before bedtime. I was closing out her app when I saw that the Maps application was still open. There was a search history, a hotel in Miami, a restaurant in Brickell, a private marina, all from 2 weeks earlier when my wife had told me she was in Atlanta visiting a former college roommate named Jess. I remember sitting there on the edge of my daughter's bed, listening to her breathe in her sleep, staring at that screen for a very long time. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't say anything the next morning either, when my wife made coffee and kissed me on the cheek and asked if I wanted her to pick up anything on our way home from the studio. I said no thank you, and I watched her drive away. And then I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and started thinking very carefully. Here's what I knew about myself at that moment. I'm not a man who reacts. I've never been a man who reacts. I've never been a man who reacts. My father taught me that lesson the hard way when I was about 12 years old. We'd had a situation in our neighborhood. Someone had wronged our family in a way that deserved a response. And my father had gone over there half-cocked and angry and said things he couldn't unsay to people he still had to live next to for another 15 years. He told me later, sitting on the back porch, that the worst decisions he ever made in his life were the ones he made while his blood was still hot. He said, "Marcus, when something hurts you, you take a breath. You take a long breath. And then you find out exactly what you're dealing with before you do a single thing about it." So I took a breath. I called in a favor from a colleague who'd gone through a divorce 2 years earlier and quietly got the name of a good family law attorney. I didn't schedule a consultation yet. I just wanted the name in my phone. I checked her credit card statements going back 4 months, not because I was looking for more evidence of betrayal, but because I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. The hotel in Miami was paid for separately, which meant either cash or another account I didn't know about. There were charges at a restaurant in Brickell. 2 people's worth of food, the kind of prices you see when someone is trying to impress. There was a florist. I sat with that for a while. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was calm through all of it because that would be a lie. There were nights where I lay in bed next to my wife and felt something I can only describe as a deep structural failure happening somewhere inside my chest, like a beam giving way under a load it was never designed to carry. I built my whole professional life around anticipating that kind of failure, identifying it early, reinforcing before the collapse. But this wasn't concrete and steel. This was something I didn't have calculations for. On the 3rd day, I did something that I still think about, something that seemed crazy at the time but turned out to be the most important decision I made through this entire thing. I called my father-in-law. His name is Don Donovan. He's 68 years old, retired from 20 years in the Air Force and another 15 in private aviation consulting, and he is without question one of the most clear-eyed, principled men I have ever known. He was the first person in my wife's family to accept me without conditions. The first one who looked me in the eye at a family dinner and said, "I can see what you're doing for her and I appreciate it." We'd had a running tradition for years. We watched playoff games together. We talked on the phone roughly once a month about nothing in particular, which is the best kind of phone call. I trusted him the way I trusted my own father, which is not something I say lightly. I didn't tell him everything on that first call. I told him enough. I said, "Sir, I need to talk to you in person when you have time, and I need you to know that I'm not calling you to blow anything up. I'm calling you because I'm trying to make the right decision, and I don't want to make it alone." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I'll drive up Friday. Tell Claire I'm coming to take you both to dinner, and then meet me for coffee at the Marriott on Glenwood at 10 in the morning. Don't say a word to her before then." I didn't. We sat across from each other at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee between us, and I laid it out for him quietly and completely. The iPad, the hotel, the restaurant charges, the florist, the Atlanta trip that wasn't an Atlanta trip. I told him I hadn't confronted her yet, and I hadn't contacted a lawyer yet, and I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I did either one of those things. I asked him to tell me if he knew anything I should know. He was quiet for a long time. He turned his coffee cup in his hands the way men do when they're measuring their words. Then he looked up at me and said, "Marcus, I owe you a conversation I should have had with you before you married my daughter." He told me about a man named Derek Ashby, wealthy real estate developer, South Florida money, the kind of man who treats married women like a sport and their husbands like an inconvenience. My wife had met him 8 months ago at a design expo in Charlotte when he was looking for someone to handle interiors on a new luxury condo project. The project was legitimate. The way he operated was not. Her father had heard the name through a mutual contact in the industry and hadn't liked what he'd heard, but he'd told himself it was professional, told himself his daughter was smarter than that. I asked him if he thought she'd already crossed a line, or if this was still a situation that could be stopped. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I think you caught it." And I think what happens next depends entirely on how this conversation goes tonight. Because here's what we'd agreed to do. He was going to take us to dinner as planned, and after dinner, he was going to ask me to go get the car, and while I was gone, he was going to tell our daughter that he needed a few minutes alone with her. And in those few minutes, he was going to ask her one direct question. Just one. And he was going to tell me tomorrow morning what she said. I spent that dinner watching my wife in a way I hadn't let myself do in 2 weeks. She was warm with her father. She was relaxed. She laughed at his stories and touched his arm when he said something that moved her, the way she'd always done. She reached over and put her hand on mine twice during dinner, and both times I turned my hand over and held hers back, because even then, even with everything I knew, I didn't want to take more from either of us than I absolutely had to. When I came back from getting the car, her father was standing by the restaurant door alone. My wife was inside paying the check, which was also part of the plan. He looked at me and said 2 words, "She hasn't." And then he said, "But she was going to." He drove back to his hotel. My wife and I drove home. We got the kids to bed. She poured herself a glass of wine and asked me if I wanted to watch something. I said I wasn't feeling great and went upstairs early. I lay in the dark for 4 hours. I did not sleep. She came home from the studio 3 days later to find me sitting in the kitchen. The kids were at my sister's house for the night. I'd made dinner. Not a special dinner. Not the kind of production you make when you're trying to soften someone up for bad news. Just dinner. Pasta and a salad and bread from the bakery she likes. 2 glasses of water on the table. I wasn't trying to create an atmosphere. I was trying to create conditions for an honest conversation. And I'd learned from watching too many situations go sideways in my life that honest conversations don't need candles. They need chairs and time and the willingness to stay in the room. She noticed the kids were gone before she even put her bag down. She asked where they were. I told her. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, reading the room the way she always did. She had a talent for walking into a space and immediately understanding its emotional architecture. She asked me if everything was okay. I told her to sit down. I want to tell you that what followed was some kind of dramatic confrontation, the kind you see in movies where voices are raised and accusations are hurled and people say the things they've been holding back for months. But that's not who I am, and honestly, after 2 weeks of careful preparation, I didn't need drama. I had facts. I told her about the iPad. I told her about the maps history. I told her about the credit card statements. I told her about the florist. I didn't raise my voice once. I laid it out the way I would lay out a structural assessment. Here is what I found. Here is what it indicates. Here is what I need you to help me understand. She tried 3 different responses. The first was confusion, which lasted about 30 seconds before she could see it wasn't going to work. The second was a version of the truth that wasn't the whole truth. She admitted to the Miami trip, admitted that Derek had paid for it, admitted that she'd told me she was in Atlanta because she knew how it looked. But she held the line on nothing happened, nothing physical. I pressed on that, not angrily, just steadily, because I needed her to understand that the line she was drawing wasn't the line I was standing at. I wasn't only asking about physical contact, I was asking about intention. The third response was the one I'd been waiting for, and it came quietly, after a long silence, when she looked at the table and said, "I don't know what I was thinking." I told her I'd spoken with her father. She went very still. I told her I'd called him 3 days after I found the iPad, that I'd driven out to meet him for coffee, that I'd told him everything I knew, and that he had told me some things I hadn't known. I told her he had already spoken to her briefly at dinner. I told her he had already spoken to her briefly at dinner. I told her he was coming back up tomorrow. She asked me why I'd called him instead of confronting her directly. I told her the truth because I was afraid of what I would say if I came at this alone and angry. Because I needed someone who loved her and also had no stake in managing her feelings. And because, I said quietly, her father asked me at our wedding rehearsal dinner if I understood what I was taking on, and I told him I did, and I wanted to honor that conversation. She started crying, not dramatic crying. Quiet, private tears. The kind that come when something you thought was hidden has been seen clearly, and the hiding itself is the thing you're most ashamed of. Her father arrived the next morning at 9. The kids were still at my sister's. My wife had barely slept. She was still in yesterday's clothes when she came downstairs and found him sitting at the kitchen table across from me, both of us with coffee, not talking. She stopped in the doorway for a moment, and I watched her father's face go soft in a way I don't think I'd ever seen it go before. He told her to sit down. Then he told her a story. He told her about a woman named Patricia, who was his mother, my wife's grandmother, who he had grown up watching take his father for granted in ways that his father was too loyal and too proud to ever fully call out. Patricia had been brilliant and beautiful and charming and chronically, almost constitutionally unable to be fully present in her own marriage. She had treated his father's devotion like a fixed resource, like a thing that would always be there regardless of what she drew from it or what she failed to replenish. His father had died early, heart attack at 61, and his mother had spent the rest of her life with a man named Frank who was fine but who was not his father, and who she had treated with the same casual disregard. Don had watched his mother grow old in a house that looked right from the outside and felt hollow from the inside, and he had sworn to himself that he would not be his grandfather. He had not been his grandfather. He had been vigilant, careful, devoted. He had also, he said quietly, looking at his hands, married a woman who was more like his grandmother than he had allowed himself to see until it was too late. My wife's mother had left when my wife was 11 and her sister was 8. She hadn't left for another man. It was more complicated than that. She had left because she had never learned how to stay, because nobody had taught her that staying was a skill you had to choose to develop, because her own mother had modeled the kind of marriage where you keep one eye on the door. Don had stayed in that house and raised 2 daughters, and he had tried, he said, to teach them differently. He thought he had succeeded. He looked at my wife across my kitchen table and said, "I thought I'd broken the pattern with you, sweetheart. I thought you'd seen enough of what it cost that you'd know better." My wife said, "Dad, I didn't do anything." He said, "I know, and I'm grateful for that. But you were going to, and that's what we need to talk about." What followed was the most painfully honest conversation I've ever sat through. I want to be clear that I wasn't asked to leave, and I didn't offer to. I sat in my own kitchen and listened to my father-in-law walk his daughter through a family history she thought she already knew, and I watched her understand, piece by piece, that the things she'd been doing, the planning, the withholding, the rationalizing, the treating our marriage like it could absorb whatever she needed it to absorb without any tending on her part, wasn't new. It had a shape. It had a genealogy. It had been handed down through women in her family, the way certain traits get passed along, not through intention, but through example, through the accumulated weight of watching people behave as though devotion is a debt that only runs one direction. Derek Ashby, Don said, was irrelevant. He wasn't the cause of anything. He was an opportunity that a certain state of mind walks toward without fully deciding to. The state of mind was the problem, the belief, somewhere underneath all the intelligence and the capability and the genuine love she had for our family, that she was somehow exempt, that the rules of reciprocity that applied to other marriages didn't quite apply to hers, that I would be there regardless, the way a good foundation stays under a house, whether anyone thinks about it or not. She broke down crying at some point during this. The kind of crying that starts in the body and works its way out. And her father got up and held her, and I watched this man hold his adult daughter the way he must have held her when she was 8 years old, and her mother had just left. And I had to look away for a minute. When she'd steadied herself, her father looked at me over her head. He said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't. He said he did. He told me that before our wedding, he and I had had a conversation. I remembered it. It was late at the rehearsal dinner, the two of us on the back patio of the venue. And that in that conversation he had been more general than he should have been. He had said things like, she needs a strong hand and she tests the people she loves, and underneath all the self-sufficiency she's looking for something she didn't get enough of growing up. He said he had told me the truth, but he had told it in a language that could be interpreted as charming instead of cautionary, and that wasn't fair to me. I told him I'd understood more than I let on even then. He nodded. He said, "I know you did. That's why I'm glad she married you. And I need you to decide, right now, with both of us in this room, what you want to do. Not what you think you should do. What you actually want." I thought about it for a long time before I answered. The kids were coming home at 3 o'clock. The pasta from last night's dinner was still in a container in the refrigerator. The house was quiet in the way that good houses get quiet on cold mornings, the kind of quiet that's not empty but resting. I'd spent 2 weeks preparing for this conversation, and somewhere in the middle of all that preparation I'd also had to ask myself the question he was now asking me out loud, because the preparation would have meant nothing if I didn't know the answer on the other side of it. I said, I want my wife back. Not the version of her that was making plans she didn't tell me about. The version that argued with somebody at a party about a couch and was completely right. I said I wanted her to understand what she'd been doing. Not just in the last 8 months, but in a longer pattern I'd been watching from a distance without fully naming. And I wanted her to actually decide, not promise, decide, whether she was willing to do the work of breaking it. She was looking at me when I said that. She said, "I know what I've been doing. I've known for a while, and I've been telling myself it was different because I hadn't technically done anything." And she said, "That's exactly the kind of thing my grandmother probably told herself too." Her father stood up and said he was going to go for a walk and give us some time. We sat there in the kitchen for a long time after he left. She told me about Derek. Not to confess anything specific, but to tell me the truth about how it had started and how she had let it progress further in her mind than it had gone in reality. And how at some point in Miami, she had looked at herself in a hotel bathroom mirror and felt a kind of vertigo she hadn't expected. She said she'd called her father the next morning before she flew home. She hadn't told him everything, but she'd called him and she thought maybe some part of her was hoping he'd be the one to stop her. I told her she should have called me. She said, "I know. I was afraid you'd let me." I sat with that for a while. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest, and after everything, honest was what I needed most. We picked up our children at 3 o'clock. Our son ran straight to me and my daughter ran straight to her mother, and I watched my wife hold our daughter like she was holding something she'd almost lost. And I thought about load-bearing walls, about what it actually takes to keep a structure standing, about the difference between a building that looks solid and one that is solid all the way through. Her father stayed 2 more days. The 3 of us had dinner together both nights with the kids, and the conversation was easy in the way that conversations go easy, after the hard work is already done. Before he left, he took me aside and shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. And he didn't say anything, and I didn't need him to. I never contacted that attorney. I'm not going to tell you that everything was immediately fine, because it wasn't, and it isn't. And we're still doing the work of understanding what the last year actually meant and what we need to do differently going forward. We're seeing a counselor together, someone my wife found and suggested herself, which mattered to me more than I expected it to. There are conversations we're still in the middle of, things that don't have clean resolutions yet, questions I still ask myself in the quiet hours. But here's what I keep coming back to. I think the most important thing I did in this whole situation was take my father's advice from 30 years ago and not make the decision while my blood was still hot. I gave myself 2 weeks in a conversation with a good man, And what came out the other side wasn't perfect, but it was true. And whatever I'm building now, I'm building it on something real. My wife called her sister last week. They talked for 2 hours, the kind of conversation they hadn't had in years. I don't know everything that was said, but afterward my wife came downstairs and sat next to me on the couch and put her head on my shoulder, and she said my grandmother died alone, Not physically alone, Not physically alone, but alone in the way that matters. And then she said, I don't want that. I put my arm around her. I said, me either. Outside, our son was shooting hoops in the driveway. Our daughter was at the kitchen table drawing something elaborate with too many colored pencils the way she always does. The house was making its ordinary sounds around us, the furnace kicking on, the refrigerator cycling, the small mechanical breathing of a home that is lived in and cared for. I know what I'm working with now. I know its stresses and its load points and its history. I know where it was built strong and I know where it needs reinforcement. And I've known since I sat across from my father-in-law in that corner booth with 2 cups of coffee between us and told the truth about what I'd found, that the only way to keep something standing is to stop pretending the cracks aren't there. So that's what we're doing. We're not pretending anymore.